The morning sun filtered through Helen's kitchen window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor she'd walked on for 37 years. At 73, she moved with the careful grace of someone who understood that each step mattered more than it used to. The house felt larger these days, not because anything had changed about the rooms themselves, but because the silence had grown to fill every corner where laughter and conversation once lived. Helen's story isn't unique, though it might feel that way to her on particularly quiet afternoons. Across the country, millions of seniors face the reality of aging without a traditional support network. Some never had children, others watched theirs move across continents for careers and dreams. Some outlived spouses and siblings, while others simply found themselves in that peculiar modern situation where family exists but remains emotionally or geographically distant. But here's what struck me most about Helen when I first heard her story. She wasn't asking for pity. Instead, she was asking a question that reflects profound emotional wisdom. How do I build a life that feels full and safe when the world assumes I have someone taking care of me? This question touches the heart of senior empowerment in ways we rarely discuss openly. Society often paints aging as a gradual surrender of independence, a slow fade into needing rescue. Yet Helen and countless others like her are discovering something different entirely. Life after 60 can become a masterclass in self-advocacy, community building, and the kind of resilience that only comes from truly knowing yourself. The reality is both more challenging and more hopeful than most people realize. When someone has no traditional caregiver, they face practical hurdles that can feel overwhelming. Medical emergencies with no one to call, heavy groceries that need carrying, technology that seems designed by and for people half their age. The emotional weight can be even heavier. Holidays that highlight absence, medical appointments faced alone, and that creeping worry about what happens if something goes wrong. Yet within these challenges lies an opportunity for a different kind of independence. Helen discovered this 3 months ago when her neighbor, Richard, knocked on her door during a power outage. They'd lived next to each other for decades, but had never done more than wave politely. That evening, sharing candles and stories over lukewarm tea, they realized they'd both been navigating similar fears and frustrations. Independent living for seniors without traditional family support requires intentional strategies that go beyond the obvious safety measures. It's about creating chosen family, building systems that work when you're the only one monitoring them, and developing the emotional strength to ask for help without feeling like a burden. The 5 safety strategies we'll explore aren't just about avoiding falls or remembering medications, though those matter enormously. They're about creating a life structure that honors both your need for independence and your very human need for connection. They're about recognizing that aging gracefully doesn't mean aging alone, even when biology or circumstances left you without traditional caregivers. Helen's journey into this new chapter began with a simple realization. She had spent so much energy worrying about who wasn't there that she'd missed seeing who was. The postal worker who noticed when mail piled up, the pharmacist who remembered her name, the librarian who saved books she might enjoy. But there was still that nagging question that kept her awake some nights, the one that would soon change everything about how she approached her golden years. What would happen if she fell and no one found her for days? The answer to that question would surprise even Helen herself. Hashtag Chapter 2, The Weight of Quiet Years. Helen hadn't always lived alone. For 28 years, she'd shared this house with Robert, her husband who could fix anything with his hands and who never met a neighbor he couldn't charm into a lengthy conversation about baseball or the weather. After he passed 5 years ago, she discovered that grief wasn't just about missing someone. It was about learning to be a completely different version of yourself. Life after retirement had looked nothing like the brochure suggested. She and Robert had planned to travel, maybe get that RV they'd talked about for decades. Instead, his diagnosis came just 6 months after his retirement party. And suddenly their golden years became about hospital visits and medication schedules and learning to find joy in smaller moments between the difficult ones. The house held layers of their shared life in ways that both comforted and challenged her. Robert's coffee mug still sat in the cabinet. Not because she couldn't bear to move it, but because she'd simply gotten used to washing around it. His workshop in the garage remained exactly as he'd left it, tools arranged with the precision of someone who believed everything had its proper place. Sometimes she'd stand in the doorway, breathing in the lingering scent of wood shavings and motor oil, feeling both grateful for the memories and uncertain about what to do with all the space his absence had created. Senior reflection had become an unexpected companion during these quiet years. Helen found herself thinking not just about what she'd lost, but about who she'd been before she became half of Helen and Robert. She'd been a high school English teacher for 34 years, someone who could command a classroom full of teenagers and make them care about poetry. She'd organized the faculty talent show, coached the debate team, and somehow managed to remember the names of over 2,000 students throughout her career. Where had that confident woman gone? When had she started second-guessing herself about everything from grocery shopping to answering the phone? The realization hit her one Thursday afternoon while sorting through old photo albums. In picture after picture from her teaching years, she saw someone vibrant and engaged, someone who tackled challenges with curiosity rather than worry. Even in photos with Robert, she could see her own distinct energy, not diminished by partnership, but enhanced by it. Finding purpose after decades of structured work schedules and clear responsibilities had proven more complex than she'd anticipated. Retirement advice always focused on hobbies and volunteer work, but rarely addressed the deeper question of identity. Who was she when she wasn't Mrs. Henderson to her students or Mrs. Patterson to her neighbors? Who was Helen when Helen was all there was? The question gained urgency 3 weeks ago when she received a call from Sandra, one of her former students who'd become a successful lawyer in another state. Sandra had tracked her down to thank her for a lesson about perseverance that had stayed with her through law school. After the call, Helen sat in her kitchen feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: useful. That feeling sparked something unexpected. Helen began reaching out to other former colleagues, not just for social connection, but to explore something that had been brewing in the back of her mind. What if her years of experience could serve a purpose beyond her own daily routine? Emotional resilience, she was learning, wasn't about bouncing back to who you used to be. It was about discovering who you could still be. But with that realization came new uncertainties. Was it too late to reinvent herself? And more practically, how could she build something meaningful when she was still figuring out basic safety concerns? The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. The caller ID showed a number she didn't recognize, and for a moment, her hand hesitated over the receiver. These days, every unknown call felt like a potential threat. Scammers targeting seniors, automated messages, or worse, some kind of emergency she wasn't prepared to handle alone. But something made her answer anyway, a decision that would soon change everything about her carefully ordered solitude. Hashtag Chapter 3, Unexpected Connections. Mrs. Patterson, this is David Chun from Riverside Community Center. I hope I'm not disturbing you. Helen's grip tightened on the phone. She'd heard about scams that started exactly like this. Friendly voices using formal addresses to gain trust. But something in the caller's tone made her pause before hanging up. I'm calling because your name came up in a conversation with Margaret Ellis. She mentioned you might be interested in our new program for seniors who want to share their professional experience with younger community members. Margaret Ellis. Helen hadn't heard that name in months, though they taught in neighboring districts for over a decade. The memory of their last conversation surfaced. Margaret mentioning something about staying busy in retirement, though Helen had been too wrapped up in her own struggles to pay close attention. What kind of program? Helen found herself asking, surprising herself with a question. As David explained the community mentoring initiative, Helen felt something stir that she'd almost forgotten existed: professional curiosity. The program connected retired educators with young adults facing various life transitions. Recent immigrants learning to navigate American systems, former foster youth aging out of care, people returning to school after years in the workforce. We're not talking about formal teaching, David continued. More like being a steady presence, someone who's been through life's ups and downs and can offer perspective without judgment. After hanging up, Helen sat in her kitchen as afternoon shadows lengthened across the floor. The conversation had awakened something complex, part excitement, part terror. For 5 years, she'd been shrinking her world to manageable proportions. Grocery stores during off-peak hours, medical appointments scheduled back-to-back to minimize trips, social interactions limited to brief exchanges with checkout clerks and postal workers. Senior reflection had become her constant companion during these years, but it had focused primarily on loss and limitation. Now, unexpectedly, she found herself remembering not just what she'd given up, but what she'd been good at, really good at. She'd been the teacher other faculty members sent their most challenging students to see. Not because she was stricter, but because she had a gift for seeing potential where others saw problems. She remembered Jason, the kid everyone expected to drop out, who'd gone on to become a paramedic, and Lisa, who'd struggled with severe anxiety, but found her voice through the school's poetry club that Helen had started. Finding purpose in retirement suddenly felt less like grasping at straws and more like remembering a language she'd always spoken fluently. But with that recognition came familiar fears. What if she'd lost her touch? What if the confidence she'd felt in a classroom 20 years ago wouldn't translate to whatever this mentoring role demanded? More practically, there were logistics to consider that hadn't existed when she'd had Robert as backup. How would she get to meetings if her car broke down? What if she had a medical emergency while committed to helping someone else? The weight of being her own safety net felt heavier when contemplating expanding her world beyond the comfortable routine she'd created. That evening, Helen did something she hadn't done in months. She called Margaret Ellis. "Helen, I was hoping David would reach you." Margaret's voice carried the same energy Helen remembered from faculty meetings decades ago. "I have to tell you, this program has been incredible. I'm working with a young woman named Sophia who's trying to finish her GED while raising 2 kids. Reminds me so much of students we used to see who just needed someone to believe in them." As Margaret talked about her experience, Helen felt a familiar pull. The same feeling she'd had when planning lessons that might reach a struggling student or organizing events that brought the school community together. But underneath the excitement was a nagging worry that had become her constant companion since Robert's death. "Margaret," Helen interrupted gently, "how do you manage the practical stuff? I mean, what if something happens and you can't show up for someone who's counting on you?" The pause on the other end of the line stretched just long enough for Helen to wonder if she'd revealed too much about her fears. When Margaret finally spoke, her voice carried an understanding that surprised Helen with its depth. "Helen, can I ask you something? When you were teaching and got the flu, what did you do?" I found coverage. Made sure my students were taken care of." "Right, because caring about people doesn't mean you have to carry everything alone." The conversation ended with Helen agreeing to think about it, but as she prepared for bed that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that thinking wasn't really the issue anymore. The question had shifted from whether she wanted to do this to whether she was brave enough to build the support systems that would make it possible. And lurking beneath that question was another one that had been growing stronger each day. What if the very act of helping others was exactly what she needed to figure out how to help herself? The answer came sooner than expected, though not in the way Helen had imagined. 2 days after her conversation with Margaret, she was sorting through Robert's desk, a task she'd been avoiding for months, when she found a manila envelope wedged behind a drawer. Her name was written across it in Robert's careful handwriting, along with a date from just 3 weeks before his death. Inside was a letter she'd never seen and a cashier's check that made her sit down hard in Robert's old chair. The amount was substantial, money from a small investment account he'd apparently maintained separately from his own finances. But it was the letter that left her staring at the paper with trembling hands. "My dearest Helen," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm probably gone and you're probably feeling lost. I know you well enough to know you're second-guessing everything and wondering how to manage alone. This money isn't meant to solve problems. It's meant to give you choices. Use it for something that scares you a little bit. Use it to remember who you were before you became half of us. The letter went on to mention specific memories: Helen organizing the school's first scholarship fund, her dream of starting a literacy program for adults, conversations they'd had about what she might do someday when they had more time or resources. Robert had been listening more carefully than she'd realized, cataloging dreams she'd barely acknowledged having. But the real shock came in the final paragraph. "I've been in touch with your brother Michael. I know you two haven't spoken in years, but grief makes people reevaluate things. He's been asking about you. His number is on the back of this letter. Call him or don't. That's your choice. But know that you have more people who care about you than you think." Helen's hands shook as she turned the letter over. Michael's phone number, written in Robert's handwriting, stared back at her. Her brother, 15 years younger and 3,000 miles away in Oregon. They'd had a falling out over their mother's care 8 years ago. Harsh words about responsibility and sacrifice that had felt impossible to take back. Helen had been managing their mother's increasing dementia largely alone while Michael pursued his career in software development. When their mother passed, the silence between them had calcified into something that felt permanent. The timing felt almost cruel, just as she was contemplating expanding her world through the mentoring program. This reminder of family connections severed by pride and misunderstanding appeared like a ghost from her carefully buried past. Rediscovery after 60 apparently meant confronting not just new possibilities, but old wounds she'd convinced herself were healed. Helen found herself pacing the house, the letter clutched in one hand and her phone in the other. The mentoring program had felt manageable, a way to help others while gently testing her own capabilities. But reaching out to Michael felt like jumping off a cliff with no safety net. What if he didn't want to hear from her? What if 8 years had been too long? What if attempting to heal family bonds only reopened wounds that had finally stopped bleeding? Yet the money Robert had left suggested new beginnings were possible, even necessary. The amount was enough to hire help when she needed it, to travel if Michael wanted to see her, to fund the kind of literacy program she'd always dreamed of starting. It was seed money for a completely different kind of life, one where she wasn't just surviving alone, but creating something meaningful with the time she had left. The phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. This time the caller ID showed Margaret's number, and Helen answered without hesitation. "Helen, I hope you don't mind me calling again." Margaret's voice was excited, almost breathless. "Something amazing just happened, and I had to share it with someone who would understand. Sophia, the young woman I mentioned, just got her GED results. She passed, and she's starting community college in the fall. But here's the thing that made me think of you immediately." Margaret paused, and Helen could hear her taking a deep breath before continuing. "She wants to become a teacher. She said our conversations about education and believing in students made her realize she wants to be that person for other kids who feel lost in the system. Helen, we're not just mentoring people, we're creating the next generation of mentors." As Margaret talked about Sophia's plans and the ripple effect of their involvement, Helen felt something shift inside her chest. The fear was still there, but was being crowded out by something larger and more urgent. Purpose wasn't just about filling her own empty hours. It was about multiplication, about impact that extended far beyond her own immediate concerns. But now she had choices to make that felt impossibly intertwined. Call Michael and risk reopening old wounds, or continue living with the regret of unfinished family business. Use Robert's money to build something new, or let fear convince her it was too late for major changes. Join the mentoring program as a way to ease back into community engagement, or recognize that maybe the time for easing was over. Standing in her kitchen as evening settled around the house, Helen realized that the question was no longer whether she was ready for change. Change had found her in the form of mysterious phone calls, forgotten letters, and the growing understanding that safety might not come from hiding, but from building the kind of life worth living boldly. The real question now was whether she had the courage to let go of the smaller, safer version of herself she'd constructed over the past 5 years and step into whatever came next. Helen made the call to Michael at 7 in the morning, Pacific time, calculating that it would be 10 o'clock where he lived, late enough to be awake. early enough to catch him before his day, filled with meetings and obligations. Her hands were surprisingly steady as she dialed, though her heart felt like it was beating in her throat. "Helen." His voice was cautious, uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe caller ID could be trusted after 8 years of silence. "Michael, it's me. I found Robert's letter yesterday, the one with your number. I think we need to talk." What followed was not the conversation Helen had rehearsed in her mind. There were no dramatic apologies or tearful reconciliations. Instead, there was something more valuable. Honesty that came with the wisdom of age and the recognition that pride was a luxury neither of them could afford anymore. "I was so angry," Michael said after they had covered the basics of health and weather. "Not just at you, but at the whole situation. Mom was disappearing piece by piece, and I felt helpless living so far away. It was easier to be mad at you for making decisions than to admit I was terrified and didn't know how to help." Helen found herself nodding, even though he couldn't see her. "I was drowning, Michael. I wanted to ask for help, but I was so convinced that asking meant I was failing somehow. And when you questioned my choices, it felt like you were questioning everything I'd sacrificed to take care of you." The emotional closure she'd expected from this conversation wasn't a dramatic moment of forgiveness. It was the quieter recognition that they'd both been doing their best with impossible circumstances. They'd been grieving their mother's illness in different ways, and grief, they were learning, sometimes made people push away the very support they needed most. "Robert called me about 6 months before he died," Michael said. "He was worried about you, about what would happen when you didn't have him anymore. He made me promise to stay in touch, but I was too much of a coward to reach out after the funeral." Helen closed her eyes, feeling a rush of gratitude for Robert's quiet orchestration of care that extended even beyond his death. "He was always better at seeing the big picture than I was. I've been so focused on managing alone that I forgot the difference between independence and isolation." The conversation shifted when Michael mentioned his own life changes, a recent divorce, his teenage daughter struggling with anxiety, his growing realization that career success felt hollow without meaningful relationships. "I've been thinking about moving back to the Midwest," he said. "Sarah could use a fresh start, and honestly, so could I. But I wasn't sure I'd have any family left to come back to." This was Helen's life's turning point after 60. Not a single dramatic moment, but a series of small choices that suddenly aligned to create a completely different future. She told Michael about the mentoring program, about Robert's money, about her growing understanding that safety wasn't about avoiding risk, but about building the kind of support system that made reasonable risks possible. "What if we did this together?" she found herself saying. "Not you taking care of me or me taking care of you, but actually building something meaningful together. I have resources now, and you have skills I don't have. What if we started that literacy program I always talked about?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough for Helen to worry she'd pushed too hard, too fast. Then Michael's voice came back, thick with emotion she hadn't heard from him since he was a teenager. "Helen, I've been lost for the past 2 years. I've been successful and miserable and didn't know how to change course." "What are you talking about? It sounds like the kind of work that might actually matter." After they hung up, Helen sat in her kitchen feeling fundamentally different than she had 24 hours earlier. The fears about living alone hadn't magically disappeared, but they'd been reframed. She wasn't just managing solitude anymore. She was preparing for community. The mentoring program wasn't just about helping others. It was about rebuilding her own capacity for connection and purpose. She called David Chun at the community center that afternoon and signed up for the mentor training program. She called Margaret Ellis and asked to meet Sophia, curious about the young woman whose determination was inspiring a former teacher to remember her own strength. She even called her doctor and scheduled a comprehensive physical, not because she was worried about her health, but because she was planning a future that would require her to be as strong as possible. The unexpected twist wasn't that Helen's problems were solved. It was that she discovered they weren't really problems at all. They were transitions, opportunities for the kind of growth she'd thought was behind her. Living alone had taught her self-reliance. Grief had taught her resilience. and isolation had taught her the true value of connection. That evening, as she prepared dinner for one in a kitchen that no longer felt too quiet, Helen realized that wisdom with age wasn't about having all the answers. It was about finally asking the right questions. Not, how do I manage alone, but how do I build a life worth living? Not, who will take care of me, but how can I be part of taking care of each other? The phone rang again, and this time Helen answered with genuine eagerness to discover what possibility might be waiting on the other end of the line. 3 months later, Helen's kitchen had become command central for what she and Michael had started calling the Second Chapter Project. The table where she'd once eaten solitary meals was now covered with program materials, volunteer schedules, and thank you notes from adult learners who were discovering that it's never too late to master reading or earn a high school equivalency diploma. Michael had made the move back to Illinois, bringing his 17-year-old daughter Sarah, who turned out to have inherited the family gift for teaching. Sarah had started a social media campaign to recruit young volunteers for the literacy program, bridging the gap between Helen's generation of educators and today's learners in ways that surprised everyone. The three-generation collaboration had become something none of them had planned, but all of them needed. Helen's relationship with living alone had transformed completely. She still cherished her independence and the quiet rhythms of her own schedule, but solitude no longer felt like something she was enduring. Instead, it had become the foundation from which she engaged with an ever-widening circle of connection. She'd learned that senior resilience wasn't about toughing things out in isolation. It was about building the kind of life that could weather challenges because it was supported by purpose and community. The mentoring program had paired her with 3 different individuals over the months, each teaching her as much as she taught them. There was Carlos, a 45-year-old factory worker learning to read so he could help his children with homework. Maria, a recent immigrant whose engineering degree from her home country wasn't recognized here, but whose determination reminded Helen of her most motivated students. And surprisingly, there was James, a veteran in his 70s who'd hidden his illiteracy for decades and finally found the courage to learn at an age when most people assumed such growth was impossible. Working with James had been particularly meaningful, challenging Helen's own assumptions about age and capability. Here was someone older than herself embarking on what might be considered the most fundamental learning journey possible. His quiet victories, the first time he read an entire paragraph without help, the day he successfully filled out a medical form independently, had become timeless lessons for Helen about the difference between growing older and younger. The safety concerns that had once dominated her thoughts hadn't disappeared, but they'd been woven into a larger tapestry with practical work. She'd installed better lighting and grab bars in strategic places, organized her medications more systematically, and most importantly, built multiple layers of connection so that her well-being was no longer entirely her own responsibility. Margaret Ellis checked in twice a week, Michael called every Sunday, and Sarah had taught her to use a medical alert app on her phone that could summon help with a single button press. But perhaps the most significant change was internal. Helen had discovered that dignity in aging wasn't about maintaining the illusion of complete self-sufficiency. It was about contributing meaningfully to the world while accepting help gracefully when needed. She'd stopped seeing her occasional struggles with technology or her need for assistance with heavy lifting as signs of failure, and started viewing them as normal aspects of a life lived long enough to accumulate both wisdom and physical limitations. The evening routine that had once felt lonely now carried a different weight. As she turned off lights and checked locks, Helen wasn't securing herself away from the world. She was preparing to rest so she could engage fully with tomorrow's possibilities. Her house still held the same furniture and family photos, but it no longer felt like a fortress against uncertainty. It had become a launching pad for whatever adventure each new day might bring. Robert's letter remained tucked in her kitchen drawer, though she no longer needed to reread it to remember its message. His final gift hadn't been the money, though that had certainly enabled new opportunities. His real gift had been permission to believe that her story wasn't ending. It was entering a new chapter that might be the most meaningful yet. Helen's transformation had taught her that life's quiet victories often come disguised as ordinary moments. The phone call answered instead of ignored. The volunteer application filled out despite nervous hands. The difficult conversation initiated because connection mattered more than pride. Each small, brave choice had accumulated into a completely different existence. On quiet evenings, when she reflected on how profoundly her world had expanded from those months of fearful isolation, Helen understood that she discovered something essential about growing older in America today. The question wasn't whether you had traditional family support or not. It was whether you had the courage to build the kind of community that could sustain you while you sustained others. As she prepared for bed each night, Helen often found herself smiling at the realization that at 73, she was finally learning what it meant to live boldly. Tomorrow would bring new students to encourage, new challenges to navigate, and new opportunities to discover that the best chapters of life sometimes begin when you least expect them, if you're brave enough to turn the page.